So at the risk of looking like a fool, I'm going to try a live coding exercise. I just want to show how the different pieces of the system work together. And I want to do this by showing the process by which a fairly complicated accession gets created. So in this file, I've dummied up an accession record with a little bit more than the ones we've seen so far. So we have a title, we have some regular properties like an ID. This one has two parts. We have a couple of other properties here. Under dates here we have a subrecord, so this is one of the nested records we saw before, as is external documents. And we also have a couple of relationships, so linked agents is a link from this accession records to this accession record rather to an agent person record, and we also have a link to a subject record. So when the system creates this, we're going to see the endpoint will take the accession record and it's going to pass it off to the model layer, which we'll call create from JSON, and that's going to go through the various different mixins until it finally hits the AS model root mixin, which is then going to create the thing in the database. So I want to show the flow of this through the system by adding a little bit of trace logging to the system in various places, and this is where my perilous live coding begins. To show what I mean, I'll jump to the backend accession controller, which we can find backend accession, backend controller accession. Yes, and I'll jump down to the endpoint that is responsible for creating accessions, which we saw yesterday. It may not be your yesterday, but it was my yesterday. And so you can see we have this helper called handle create, which is going to do the actual creation. So I'd just here like to be able to trace a message. So I'm going to say request context dot trace creating accession. A request context is created for every request coming into the backend, and it gives us a place to store things that are related to handling the request, and it can be information that might be of interest to the controller layer but also to the model layer. So the classic example of where we use the request context is we store the repo ID of the current request. So for a request that has a URI like repository / something, we think of that request as operating within a repository, and we use the request context to keep track of which repository is considered to be the current one. And this gets used for applying things like access restrictions, where we don't want records from other repositories to leak into the current request. So request context doesn't have a trace method, and I'm going to add one now. This is a little bit of a misuse of request context because normally we just write things to the request context once and then query them. We don't use it as a sort of global state for the system, which is what I'm about to do. But that's okay. I can get away with this because I'm screencasting. So I'll say self.trace, and let's just add a message. And we store the request context in the current thread, so I'll just say thread current request context, and I'll just initialize the trace list if it hasn't already been initialized, and then we'll just stick the message into that list, and that should do us. And so now we want a way of seeing what is being traced, and a possibly easy way of doing this is just to return it as a part of the response that the backend sends back. So if we look at this handle create method, jump to its definition, you can see it calls created response to send its response back to the user. Created response in turn calls modified response, and modified response ultimately calls JSON response. And this JSON response helper is what pretty much every method in the backend uses for sending JSON to the client. So this is a fairly good spot to put things we're interested in. So that I don't break the API, I'm just going to add it as a header. So we might just call this X trace response or something like that. And that will just be request context get trace to JSON. And with any luck, that should be enough for the backend to start sending back this trace information. So I'm going to be bold and just assume this works. And let's jump now to the AS model create from JSON method. AS model CRUD, sorry. Create from JSON. So at this point, I'm just going to add a trace method to say that we've entered it. So let's just say request context trace entered create from JSON for self. And where we have apply nested records, that's another interesting spot, so let's just add a note there to say applying nested records for self. Actually, while we're here, let's also add a note to the create, so we'll just say creating record for. Since we have this tracing, we might as well go a bit mad, so let's jump over to our mixins directory. And you can see in here these are all of the mixins that are defined for the system. So a lot of these will be adding behavior to create from JSON to enact the sort of things that they need to happen. So let's add a trace message to each of these create from JSON calls. We'll just look for anything that has a create from JSON, and for each of them we'll log a message. Request context dot trace create from JSON called for me. So external IDs, notes, recordable cataloging, related agents, relationships, and tree notes. In our example, we're not going to hit many of these, but I'll just put them in anyway. So if I've done this correctly, we should now be able to create our accession and see the trace information that we've been logging along the way. So I'll jump to a terminal now, and for this I'm going to use a script called curl_as. And curl_as is just like curl, except it allows us to log into ArchivesSpace as the user we specify. So this just saves having to do the login by hand and then taking the session ID and supplying it for the subsequent request. So in this case, I'll give curl -v option so we can see the headers. That's going to contain the trace information. And we'll pass in a file name as the body of the request. So this is going to take the JSON from that file and send it along as the request body. Now, as before, we just give the URL of the backend, and in this case the URI we're interested in is repositories to accessions, which is the endpoint for creating accessions. So if I got this right, this should work. And it seems okay. So you can see we have a status created, status created, ID9, we have a URI, and we have a trace response. So you can see that even our simple accession has run through quite a few of the mixins. We started out creating an accession, and our call to create from JSON actually first hit the auto-generator mixin, then the external IDs one, then the relationships one, which would have set up our subjects and agent links, and then finally we enter the create from JSON for accession, which is the top level AS model one. And you can see we create the record for that accession in the database, and then we start applying the nested records for that accession, and this is what takes us through to looking for records like dates. So we have create from JSON for AS date is the date subrecord being created. Create record is that record actually being put in the database, and then we apply any nested records for that date, which so a date record can support external documents, which we don't have in this case. But you can see that the nested records themselves can have nested records, and that there can be quite a lot happening behind the scenes for even a fairly simple record creation, and that's because the records tend to be quite rich and quite interrelated with other records. So just to finish this off, I'll construct another curl command to get back the accession which is created, and I'll just chop out the bits that we don't need. And you can see, maybe you can't, let me format that. You can see that the JSON that comes back is more or less the same as the JSON that we sent. We have references to subjects, we have references to linked agents, we have a couple of subrecords, we have an external document and a date. And one final thing I'd just show again is that we can then resolve these. So if we wanted to see what that subject was, for instance, we can tell curl to leave the square brackets alone, please, and just jump back over here and say resolve equals subjects. And you can see now it's resolved the subject and has inlined the subject record in the response for this accession. So you can see that the subject has terms, ArchivesSpace, and developer.